Some places don't just look abandoned, they feel infected, like the rot goes deep down into the soil. I learned that the hard way when I was just 9 years old. Back in 2016, my family moved into my grandparents' house when they decided to downsize. They had built the place in the early 90s, sitting perfectly on 5 acres of land right on the outskirts of a quiet southern town. We were surrounded by thick woods, open fields, and a slow, muddy river that wound past our southern fence. It was a beautiful, peaceful place, except for our only neighbors. On 2 sides, our property bordered an odd, crooked patch of acreage that held a house that looked like it was slowly sinking into the earth. The original farmhouse had been built in the 1920s, but over the decades, bizarre additions had been tacked on without any real plan. The siding was permanently discolored. Even on the hottest, driest days of summer, the wood looked wet and soft. The yard was an absolute nightmare. Overgrown, thorny bushes tangled with thick vines. There were broken stone fountains drowning in weeds, headless garden gnomes, and piles of trash that had clearly been rotting there for years. Plastic grocery bags flapped like pale ghosts in the tree branches, and a rusted-out lawnmower sat dead in the middle of the high grass. It was the kind of property that naturally made you hold your breath whenever you walked past it. At the time, the house belonged to 2 elderly sisters, Violet and Agnes, who were raising their 3 grandchildren. Violet was the quiet one, a ghost of a woman who spent her days rocking in a faded green chair on the porch, staring blankly at the tree line. Agnes was sharper, more alert, but you could tell every movement caused her pain. Both were easily in their late 70s. Then there were the kids. The oldest boy, Liam, was my age and in my grade at school. The other 2 were twin girls, Allison and Kelsey, who were the same age as my younger sister. Liam was incredibly unsettling. I never wanted to hang out with him, but because we shared classes, we were often lumped together. He took that tiny connection as an open invitation to completely ignore normal boundaries. He would just show up at my house. No knocking, no calling. I'd be playing a video game in my room, turn around, and he'd just be standing there in my doorway, staring. Once, I looked out my window to see him doing cannonballs in our private pool. Another time, he walked right through our front door, opened our fridge, and started eating a slice of our leftover pizza with his bare hands like he lived there. Whenever we were forced to hang out, it was miserable. He was intensely obsessed with anime, but not in a normal way. He would shout strange phrases in Japanese and get visibly furious if I didn't laugh or understand. But the scariest part was the look he would sometimes get in his eyes, like he was actively visualizing something violent. One afternoon, he chased me through the yard with a pair of rusted razor-sharp garden shears, swinging them wildly at my back and laughing hysterically like it was just a game. Another time, we were standing on an old wooden bridge that crossed the creek behind our properties, and I swear he tried to shove me over the edge into the rocky water below. He played it off as a joke, but the sinister smile on his face told me he absolutely meant to do it. The twin girls were completely different. They were quiet, almost invisible, and always covered in dirt. They had severe speech impediments that made their voices sound garbled, like toddlers, even though they were 7 years old. It was heartbreakingly obvious that no one in that sinking house was taking care of them. They flinched if you moved too fast, and they always looked starving. Their dad was constantly in and out of jail, nowhere to be found. That brings us to their mother, Teresa. The first time I properly met her, she was struggling to hook a garden hose to a rusty spigot right at the edge of our shared property line. She stood out completely from the rest of her family. She was tall, heavy-set, with thick, curly black hair, and large retro glasses. Unlike her children, her clothes were perfectly clean, and her hair was carefully styled. When she saw me, she smiled like she had been waiting for me to come over. She asked if I could help her with the stuck faucet. I walked over, gave it a firm twist, and it turned with zero effort. She gasped, dramatically clapping her hands together. She told me how incredibly strong I was and how lucky she was that I showed up. As a 9-year-old, that flattery worked. I felt proud. But then, her smile shifted into something weird. "Did you know you have a third eye?" she asked softly. I blinked, confused. "What?" Her smile grew wider. "We all have one, not a physical eye but a spiritual one. It lets you see the absolute truth." Before I could even process what she was saying, she turned and started walking toward her rotting house, gesturing for me to follow. Like an idiot, I did. The second I stepped through her front door, a physical wave of stench hit me. It smelled like spoiled meat, damp mildew, and something uniquely sickening that I couldn't even identify. The inside was a wasteland. Torn garbage bags spilled over the floors, plates of rotting food sat on stained furniture, and dirty diapers were shoved into the corners behind the couch. I turned around to leave, but Teresa suddenly grabbed my wrist. Her grip was tight. She silently led me up the creaking stairs. Her bedroom was a jarring contrast to the nightmare below. It was absolutely pristine. Pink floral wallpaper, freshly vacuumed carpets, and heavy ornate antique furniture. Shelves lined the walls, completely covered in perfectly arranged porcelain dolls with dead glass eyes. The air in there was thick with the suffocating smell of rosewater and cheap perfume. It felt like stepping into a different dimension. She pointed to a small cushioned stool in the corner, signaling for me to sit. Then, she walked over to her vanity mirror and slowly opened the top drawer. She pulled out a silver tray holding a thick unlit black candle, a jagged crystal, and a heavy leather-bound book. My eyes immediately locked onto the cover of the book. Deeply pressed into the dark leather was a large pentagram. Growing up in a strict religious household, I knew exactly what that symbol meant. My stomach dropped into my shoes, and suddenly, as if a veil had been lifted, I started seeing the symbol everywhere in the room. It was carved into her jewelry box. It was etched into the wooden frame of her mirror. It was even burned into the hardwood floor, barely hidden beneath the edge of her perfectly clean pink rug. Pure panic took over. I jumped up so fast I knocked the stool over. "Sorry, my mom wants me home." "Bye," I yelled, not waiting for a single word in response. I bolted out the door, down those rotting stairs, and ran home as fast as my legs could carry me. Things only got darker after that. In 2019, Agnes suffered a massive heart attack and collapsed dead right in the middle of their garbage-filled living room, right in front of the kids. I attended the funeral at a rundown church on the edge of town. The family sat in the front row, completely stone-faced, showing absolutely zero emotion. The only person crying was a mysterious woman sitting in the second pew, sobbing so loudly it echoed off the walls. No one in the family ever looked at her or acknowledged her existence. That same year, Liam completely snapped. He committed an unspeakable violent act against one of his little sisters and was immediately removed from the home and placed in a locked psychiatric facility. I never found out the exact details, but that night, my parents sat my sister and me down. Their faces were dead serious. They told us in no uncertain terms that we were never ever to go near that family or that property again. Eventually, Teresa and the girls packed up and vanished in the middle of the night, but they left the elderly Violet behind. They just abandoned a frail old woman to live completely alone in that decaying, rotting structure. She passed away quietly in 2020. The estate was eventually auctioned off. A few months later, one of my old elementary school teachers, Mrs. Sess, bought the property with her husband. They bulldozed almost the entire structure, but for some reason they decided to keep the original 1920s section of the farmhouse, the exact section where Teresa's pristine, rose-scented room had been. Mrs. Sess invited my family over to see the renovations. They had done an amazing job, an open floor plan, brand new appliances, fresh paint, but then she proudly took us upstairs. The second I crossed the threshold into what used to be Teresa's room, my skin started crawling. It was fully carpeted now, painted a bright, cheerful color, but I could feel it. I knew exactly where the pentagram was burned into the floorboards beneath the new carpet. It felt like the floor itself was radiating a dark, heavy energy. My stomach churned, and I felt the distinct, horrifying sensation of something staring at me from inside the walls. I faked a sudden migraine and told Mrs. Soff I had to leave immediately, missing the dinner she had planned. I successfully avoided that property until last year. Mrs. Soff, I asked if I could dog sit for a week while they went on vacation. I needed the extra cash, so I agreed, figuring the past was just in my head. Every night I'd ring the doorbell, she'd buzz me in remotely, and her two small dogs, a Shih Tzu named Muffin and a pug named Henry, would greet me happily. The first 4 nights were totally fine, peaceful even, but on the final night, everything changed. I had just fed the dogs and was getting ready to lock up and head home. Suddenly, Henry trotted over to the bottom of the staircase and froze. He planted his little legs and started barking aggressively up into the empty darkness of the second floor. Muffin didn't join in. She tucked her tail, whimpered, and slowly backed away into the kitchen. I stared up the stairs, There was absolutely nothing there. Then I heard it. Thump. A heavy, deliberate footstep coming from the second floor. I froze, holding my breath. Thump. Louder this time. Closer to the top of the stairs. I didn't call out. I didn't grab a weapon. I turned, ripped the front door open, slammed it shut behind me, and sprinted down the driveway. The entire walk back to my house, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel something heavy and furious following right behind me in the dark. It's now 2025. We hadn't heard a single whisper about Teresa or her family in over 4 years, until a few weeks ago. A girl from my old high school told me she spotted Teresa at a farmer's market a few towns over. Apparently she has started some kind of religious group, calling herself a truth seeker. They supposedly live off the grid in a mobile home community deep in the woods. Recently, strange cryptic flyers have started popping up on telephone poles and local bulletin boards around our town. I don't trust it. I don't trust her. I truly believe Teresa is a deeply evil woman. She neglected her innocent children. She abandoned her own mother to die in a rotting house. And I believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that she brought something dark into that room, something that stayed behind long after she left. I still have nightmares where Teresa and Liam are standing at the absolute edge of my bed, just staring down at me in pure silence. Even now, whenever I pass by Mrs. S's beautifully renovated house, my blood runs cold. The fresh paint, the modern furniture, it's all just a mask. That place remembers, and whatever was invited inside that room all those years ago, I don't think it ever left. You never really know who your friends are until their mask finally slips, and when it does, the face underneath might just be a monster. My name is Keegan. I live in Michigan, and for the most part my high school years were completely normal. I had a solid group of guys I hung out with, mostly at the local community center where we'd lift weights and play pickup basketball for hours. Life was simple. But looking back, I realize how easily you can let the wrong person into your life without ever noticing the red flags until it's too late. During my freshman year, as summer break was rapidly approaching, I met a kid named Clayton. He was a year younger than me, finishing up junior high. At first, he seemed totally fine. We bonded over basketball, and my dad and I even took him to see a Detroit Pistons game. He had never been to a professional game before, and he was so excited. I genuinely thought he was a good kid, but as the school year ended, my life started getting busier. I was starting driver's training and picking up a part-time job to make some cash. My free time vanished. That's when Clayton started to change. It started small. If I told him I was busy working or studying, he would get unusually quiet. Then the quiet turned into passive-aggressive anger. He had these intense, unpredictable mood swings. If he didn't get my attention exactly when he wanted it, he would lash out. One weekend, I told him I couldn't hang out because I had to stay home and deep clean the apartment. I put my phone away for a few hours. When I finally checked it, I saw he had completely removed me on Snapchat. I messaged him on another app asking what his problem was. He coldly replied that he knew I was lying just to avoid him. At that point, his clinginess was crossing the line into obsession. He was becoming suffocating. Ironically, his accusations made me actually want to avoid him. I started making up excuses. I'd say I was out with family, or already had plans with other people. I just needed space from his constant heavy pressure. But Clayton didn't handle rejection well. One evening, long after the sun had gone down, there was a heavy knock at my apartment door. I didn't have any plans, and I certainly wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Clayton was just standing there in the dim hallway lighting. "Why didn't you text me you were coming over?" I asked, confused and a little annoyed. He didn't say a single word. He just stood there, staring at me with this empty, dead-eyed expression. It was a 1,000-yard stare, like he was looking right through me. The silence stretched on for several agonizing seconds. Then, without a word, he slowly turned around and walked away into the shadows. A cold chill ran down my spine. Why did he show up so late? Why the silent treatment? It felt entirely unnatural. The very next day, I completely turned off my location sharing on every single app I had. I wanted to be invisible to him. About a month passed. I kept my distance, and the tension seemed to fade. But then I received a text from a mutual friend named Nick. Nick knew Clayton pretty well, and he also knew Clayton's recent ex-girlfriend. The message Nick sent me made my blood run completely cold. He told me the real reason Clayton had been acting so unhinged. Clayton hadn't just been dealing with a bad breakup. According to Nick, Clayton had cornered his ex-girlfriend in a fit of rage, held a sharp blade to her throat, and committed an unspeakably violent and horrifying act against her. My heart dropped into my stomach. I was dealing with a complete psychopath. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I grabbed my phone and instantly blocked him on every single platform. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. Somehow he noticed immediately. Right before I could block his Instagram, he sent a flood of frantic messages. "Why are you blocking me? What did I do? Answer me." My hands were shaking. I typed out a quick fake excuse, saying I just needed some time to myself for my mental health, and then I blocked him there too. I thought cutting him off would be the end of it. I was dead wrong. That exact same night, my parents decided to drive to the next town over to have dinner with some old friends. I was completely alone in the apartment. Around 9 a.m., the silence of the empty apartment was broken by a sharp knock at the front door. I froze. I slowly walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was completely empty. I cautiously opened the door just a crack, peering out. Nothing, not a single sound. I convinced myself it was just some neighborhood kids playing a prank. I locked the deadbolt and went back to my room. My bedroom is on the ground floor, facing the street. I walked over to shut my blinds. As I looked out the window, I noticed the street lamp on the sidewalk was completely burned out, leaving my front yard bathed in pitch black darkness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a subtle movement. A tall figure stepped out from the shadows and walked directly up to my bedroom window. It was Clayton. Panic seized my chest. I cracked the window just enough to speak and forcefully told him to leave immediately. I told him he wasn't welcome here. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "Just let me in. I need to tell you something." "No," I demanded. "Get away from my house." He didn't move, but as he shifted his weight in the darkness, a sliver of moonlight caught something in his hand. At first I couldn't process what I was looking at, but as he slowly raised his hand up to the glass, the shape became unmistakable. He was holding a massive gleaming kitchen knife. The air left my lungs. The look in his eyes wasn't just angry, it was entirely hollow. It was the look of someone who had already made up their mind to do something terrible. I slammed the window shut, locked it, and screamed through the glass that I was calling the police. I dialed 911 with shaking hands. By the time the squad cars arrived with their sirens wailing, Clayton had vanished into the night. I gave the officers a full description, but they never found him around our complex. I haven't heard a single word from him since that horrific night, but the silence doesn't bring me any peace. I honestly believe with every fiber of my being that if I had opened that door, or if he had found a way inside, I wouldn't be alive today. He came to my home in the dead of night, knowing I was alone, holding a weapon. You don't do that unless you have the darkest of intentions. The betrayal of realizing someone you trusted is capable of such profound evil changes you. It leaves a permanent scar. I still check my locks 3 times before I go to sleep. I still look over my shoulder in empty parking lots, because I know firsthand that monsters don't hide under your bed. Sometimes, they pretend to be your friend. Have you ever felt a stranger's eyes burning into the back of your head in a completely dark room? You try to brush it off, telling yourself it's just your imagination playing tricks on you. But what happens when you finally turn around and you realize your instincts were completely right? This happened in late 2022. I went on what I thought would be a fun, simple first date with a girl I had matched with on a dating app. Her name was Emily, and we had been texting back and forth for about 2 weeks before we finally decided to meet up in person. We both shared a massive love for horror movies, so when a highly anticipated psychological thriller hit the theaters, we agreed that seeing it together would be the absolute perfect first date. We picked a weekday night, a Thursday. It was a late showing, around 10:15 p.m., at a small, older theater located just outside of town. I offered to drive and picked her up around 9:30. She seemed totally normal, friendly, sweet, maybe just a little bit shy. She was quiet for most of the drive, but she really opened up once we started talking about the scary movies we used to watch growing up. When we pulled into the parking lot, it was practically a ghost town. I joked about how the theater itself looked like something straight out of a horror film. The exterior had dim lighting, a flickering neon sign, and when we walked through the front doors there was absolutely no one in the lobby. There was just one single employee working behind the concession stand. When I asked him if the theater was going to be crowded, he just laughed. He told us we were the only two people who had bought tickets for that entire showing. At first I thought that was awesome. No annoying crowds, no people talking over the dialogue, just me, Emily, and a giant screen. We walked down the long empty hallway and went into Theater 6. We chose the absolute best seats, right in the dead center, about 4 rows from the back wall. It was freezing inside the room, which Emily pointed out almost immediately. I offered her my hoodie, and we laughed about how oddly creepy it felt being the only two people sitting in this massive dark room. We leaned back and chatted comfortably while waiting for the final previews to finish. I was genuinely starting to feel a real connection between us. I figured this would be one of those rare perfect first dates, but right before the actual movie started, just as the final trailer ended and the main lights dimmed down to pitch black, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone had just walked into the theater. They didn't make a sound, they didn't stop to look around, and they didn't pull out a phone to check their seat number like a normal person would. The figure walked slowly, straight up the illuminated steps and sat down, directly behind us. I mean directly. There had to be over 100 empty seats in that room, but this stranger deliberately chose the exact seat right behind my head. Emily turned to look at him, and then she shot me a deeply uncomfortable glance. I gave a nervous little chuckle and whispered, "Figures." But almost immediately, the energy in the room shifted. Something felt completely wrong. You know that heavy sinking feeling you get when someone is staring at you with intense focus? That is exactly what it felt like. After a minute or two, I couldn't take the tension anymore. I subtly glanced back over my shoulder. He wasn't watching the massive screen in front of us. He was staring directly at us. I only looked at him for a split second, but he didn't flinch. He didn't casually look away or pretend to be interested in the movie. He was leaning forward slightly, his face angled right at the back of my head. I leaned over and whispered to Emily, "This guy is really creeping me out. He's just staring." She nodded slowly, looking genuinely frightened. "I know," she whispered back. We tried our best to ignore it. The movie started playing, and I desperately tried to focus on the screen. But every few minutes, I could feel that heavy, oppressive presence right behind me. It wasn't just someone being rude. There was an aggressive intensity to it. It felt like he was waiting for us to do something. After about 20 agonizing minutes, I shifted in my seat and turned my head enough to get a better look at him. He was still staring. He looked to be middle-aged, maybe in his late 40s. He was pale, clean-shaven, and wearing a dark gray hoodie pulled up slightly. But the most unsettling part was his expression. He looked completely hollow. His eyes weren't glazed over like someone who was just spacing out. They were locked directly onto me. And in the dim glow of the movie screen, I realized he wasn't blinking. I turned back around, my heart pounding against my ribs. Emily asked if I wanted to move to different seats. We quickly considered it, but where would we go? We would still be trapped in the exact same dark room with him. A few minutes later, the situation escalated. I felt a sudden distinct change in the air. The man exhaled. It wasn't a loud sigh or a cough. It was a slow, deliberate breath, and I felt the warmth of it right against the back of my neck. I spun around instantly. He had leaned entirely forward, draping his upper body over the back of my seat. His face was mere inches away from mine in the dark. I stared right into his wide, unblinking eyes and said, "Dude, can you not?" He didn't say a single word. He didn't apologize. He just slowly, silently leaned back into the shadows of his seat. That was the breaking point. I looked at Emily and said, "We need to move, now." We grabbed our things and quickly walked all the way down to the very front corner row. The viewing angle was terrible, but we desperately needed distance. I couldn't even focus on the movie anymore. I just kept glancing back into the darkness, and every single time I looked, his head was turned, staring straight down at us from the top section. He never moved his eyes. About halfway through the movie, we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the carpeted stairs. He was coming down. Emily grabbed my arm with a vice grip, and we both froze, holding our breath. The slow, heavy footsteps stopped just a few rows above us in the dark. We didn't dare turn around to look. I don't know how long he stood there, hovering in the shadows behind us. It felt like an eternity. Finally, the footsteps retreated back up to the top row. "We need to leave," I whispered. She nodded frantically. We slipped out of our seats and Power walked up the aisle toward the exit. As we pushed through the heavy theater doors and stepped out into the brightly lit hallway, I glanced back through the small glass window on the door. The man was no longer in his seat. He was standing dead center in the middle of the aisle. He wasn't looking at the movie screen. He was standing perfectly still, staring right at the door we had just walked through. We practically ran to the concession stand at the front lobby. I immediately told the worker that there was a guy acting incredibly creepy in Theater 6. The worker's friendly smile vanished instantly. He let out a heavy sigh and muttered, "Again? What do you mean again?" I asked, my blood running cold. The worker looked incredibly uncomfortable. "He's been coming in randomly for about a month now," he explained. "He always buys a ticket for the late night showings, but he never buys food or drinks, and you guys aren't the first ones to complain about him doing this. Then why hasn't anyone kicked him out or called the police?" I demanded. "Management says he hasn't technically done anything illegal," the worker replied, looking down. "Unless he physically touches someone or explicitly breaks a theater rule, our hands are tied. We can't do anything." Emily was visibly shaking at this point, on the verge of tears. She asked if someone could walk us out to our car. The worker agreed, and a theater janitor escorted us into the dark parking lot. We never saw the man follow us outside, but the entire drive back to Emily's house, I couldn't shake the terrifying paranoia that he might have memorized my license plate. What if he slipped out a side door, watched us leave, and decided to follow us at a distance? For weeks afterward, I checked my rearview mirror constantly. I avoided that entire side of town. Emily and I texted a few times after that night, but the trauma of that experience completely ruined the vibe. We never ended up seeing each other again. I have never been back to that theater since. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering about that hollow-eyed man in the dark gray hoodie. I wonder how many other people have sat down in a dark, empty theater, only to realize they weren't alone.